I love the MCG, that great Coliseum, 800 metres from the CBD, Central Business District of Melbourne. How many other cities in the world have something like the Melbourne Cricket Ground so close? But it's not the architecture that I love. It's not even the sport, those finely tuned athletes running around chasing a ball. It's not that. It's the crowd. The crowd at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, every socio-economic group of this city, every religion, Jews, Muslims, Christians, atheists, Collingwood supporters, all mixed up together. And somewhere in the ground is that guy with the big biceps, the tattoo, the rotten teeth that you might call fascinating. Next to him will be sitting the guy in the suit and tie. And at some point in the game when the abuse is hurled at the umpire or the opposition, the guy in the tattoo says, "Settle down, mate, watch your mouth, there are kids here." It's an amazing thing the way these socio-economic groups coalesce around the Melbourne Cricket Ground. But it's not even at the game that I love it. It's after the game. When people leave, 50% of the crowd are happy, 50% of the crowd are really annoyed. And they're all mixed in, leaving the ground. Someone happy, someone unhappy. And what happens? No violence, no riots, no flares, no lines of policemen keeping separated supporters apart. None of that. And next time you go, look at the most amazing thing, the teenagers, unsupervised. Where else in the world could a 14-year-old girl rock up to mum and dad and say, "Hi mum, hi dad, I'm going to a mass public event with 100,000 people and no adult supervision," and mum says, "See you when you get home, dear." And she does. It's an amazing thing, the Melbourne Cricket Ground. And you know why I love it? You know why I get such a sense of serenity and calm in this crowd? Because in my life, having worked with the UN and the Red Cross, I've been to Afghanistan, I've been to Pakistan, I've been to 6 wars. I've been to Mindanao, I've been to Bosnia, Kosovo, Sri Lanka, East Timor, Rwanda, Nyatarama Church, south of Kigali. 3,500 rotting human corpses. On the top, a baby's head. Not the body, just the head. The empty eye sockets looking at you. Accusatory. Why did you let this happen? And the smell. How close the smell of death is to the smell of love. A musky, dirty smell. But death burns the back of the nostrils. And it never leaves. And in my life, I have had the opportunity to experience both genocide and the G. And that's why I love it so much, because of what the MCG symbolises. And think about this. Melbourne is the world's most livable city, in a country that is either number 1 or number 2 on the Human Development Index, according to the United Nations. Let me rephrase that. The world's most livable city in a country that's either number 2 or number 1 on the Human Development Index. Isn't another way of phrasing that the ideal example of humanity on the face of the earth today? Melbourne, Australia. And how many of us think about it in that way? How many of us value that strength? How many of us see that as this great opportunity with everything that's going on in the world today? And what is going on in the world today? We love to talk about the rise of China, the blue line. because we have such a poor time frame. If we go back a bit further, we look back to about 1500, we see that China, India and Indonesia between them had much more than 80% of the global economy. Back then, the percentage of your economy in the globe roughly equated to the percentage of your population. And then there was this huge productivity spurt with the Industrial Revolution. A huge productivity spurt that saw Western Europe, the United States, United Kingdom get this huge boom, which meant that by 1950, India, China, Indonesia were less than 10% of the global economy. But now, with the global economy spreading, with knowledge spreading, these productivity gains are being shared throughout the world. So now we see countries rising back as the world heads back to a situation where the rough economic size and the rough population size will more or less again come into alignment. So China is not rising, it's returning. India is not rising, it's returning. Indonesia is not rising, it's returning. And what does that mean? There is not a once in a lifetime, not a once in a generation, not a once in a century, but a once in an epoch shift from the white Anglo-Saxon Christian world to the Asian, Buddhist, Hindu, Islamic world. Islam. How many of you are scared? How many of you see this as a threat? How many of you are worried about this as opposed to seeing it as an opportunity? Now imagine this. Imagine if somewhere in the world there was a country that had within it the ideal cultural mix of Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, Christians, atheists, Collingwood supporters. Imagine a country in the ideal time zone. Imagine a country in the ideal geography. And imagine if that country were perceived by everyone as someone they could trust, someone they could work with. This country would be the hinge through which this great epochal shift passes. And the children and the grandchildren of this country would be the most powerful, the wealthiest, and the most important people on a planet for a century. Imagine if that country existed. And what are we doing about it? What are we doing with this opportunity? Beef. A couple of years ago, we, without notice, cut off live exports to Indonesia based on what we saw on a television program. Now, I get it. I actually do. The conditions inside Indonesian abattoirs weren't great. I can see why that upset a lot of Australians. But think about it from the Indonesian perspective. Without notice, we cut off their protein supply. At the very minimum, they must have perceived us as a fickle and unreliable trading partner. No wonder they started looking for other sources of protein, and maybe that's why they cut us off. Was there an alternative? Could we have done something else? Imagine if instead we looked at our multicultural population, our Islamic population, as an asset, not a threat. Imagine if instead we thought, well, what we should do is butcher halal beef and export it. If we took our Islamic population and created a perception of trust in the region, so we could send our beef. And guess what? We already kind of do it. We export halal beef to about 40 countries in a trade worth $600 million. And imagine if we put the same amount of energy into building up that trust as we did to cutting off the trade. Imagine if we had to have used taxpayer funds through Austrade to be able to say to the region, you can trust us. We know your religion, we know your culture, because heck, it's partly ours too. Because we have Muslims in our country. and we trust them. But no, that's not what we did with our taxpayer funds. You know what we did with our taxpayer funds? We sent an ad all through the region. A little map of Australia, a red circle around it, a line through it, and the words, "No way." And we were dumb enough to think only asylum seekers would read it. I mean, what was going through our heads? Imagine the kid in school in Indonesia or Malaysia, 8 years old, grows up, builds a business, and looks for somewhere to trade and remembers the words, "No way." We've lost that opportunity. Is that the cost of our fear? The lost opportunity? And it's funny, 6th graders get it. I went to my godson's 6th grade class the other week. They asked me to talk about asylum seekers. And in the middle of the class, I turned around and I said, "Hey guys and girls, do you trade with each other? You know, things like footy cards." They're like, "Yeah." "Do you trade with people you don't like?" "No." 6th graders get it. Perception is an economic policy. People, when they can help it, do not trade with people they don't like and trust. Punto. And education is such an important part of trade for us in Australia. Do you know, Access Economics estimates that for every 2 international students in this country, there is 1 additional job. Not only that, international students cross-subsidise Australian students, so international students aren't pinching from Australians' education places, they're giving more back to us. And did you know, according to some estimates, in 2015 we are 75,000 international students down compared to what we were predicting in 2010. 75,000 international students down, 37,500 Australian jobs. But that's not the cost of our fear, is it? Universities Australia did a study back in 2011, really worried about what was causing this downturn in international education. They thought it was the dollar, the strength of the Australian dollar. It was a little bit, but not as much as they thought. They thought the Indian students issue would be a problem. It was a little bit, but not as much as they thought. They thought maybe visa changes affected it, and it did a little bit, but not as much as they thought. You know what surprised them? In the words of Glenn Withers, then Chief of Universities Australia, you know what was causing a big part of the downturn? I quote his words, not mine. "The perception of Australia as an unwelcoming country in the way it conducts the refugee debate," unquote. Not what our policy is, but the way we conduct the refugee debate. Perception. When we connected the Chan and Sukumaran executions with the tsunami aid, we annoyed a lot of Indonesians and they protested in the streets. And they held up signs like these: "We don't need Australian education." Well, they might not need our education, but we certainly need their students. Perception. Think back to 2001, when the Tampa came along and those refugees were turned around. And politicians said to us, do we want these sorts of people in our country? Why is it that we couldn't say, you mean someone willing to risk their lives for nothing more than the better future for their children? My oath, we want these people in our country. In every country that accepts refugees and allows them access to the economy, they add jobs. They don't pinch them. Minimum 1.1 job for every refugee. In other words, for every 10 refugees turning around, we're losing a job for Australians? Is this the cost of our fear? Perception. Imagine if in 2001, instead of having a border protection policy, we had a controlled entry policy. You could have the same policy frameworks in place, including discouraging boats, by creating a much better regional treaty for processing and resettlement. Many of the policy settings could be the same. It's just the narrative would be different. Perceptions. Border control policy. Controlled entry policy. Which one creates the better perception? Which one creates the larger opportunity for this country? We have a once-in-an-epoch opportunity. As power shifts from the white Anglo-Saxon Christian world to the Asian, Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu world, the world does not need another country to cringe away from. The world needs a hinge. The world needs a cultural translator. And we do have the ideal cultural mix in this country, the second most multicultural in the world. We are in the ideal geography. We are in the ideal time zone. And we are in control of our own perception. But if we, the people, think our leaders are failing us and are not taking this opportunity, shouldn't we be like the guy in the crowd with the big biceps, the tattoos and the rotten teeth and remind our leaders it's about the children, the opportunity for our children and our grandchildren that we might be taking away? We can be the great cultural translator. We can be the hinge through which this great epochal shift passes. And what are the things of my dreams? I do not want future generations to look back and say, never was there a country given such an easy path to greatness that so meekly squandered it for the sake of short-term politics. And as Obama said in another setting, we might be the first generation to see it, but we're the last generation who can stop it. The window for this opportunity is closing rapidly, but we can do it. It starts with us. It starts with you and me. And if you agree with me that the world needs this hinge, and we are the right culture, and we are the right location, and we are the right time zone, then stand with me after today and go out and say to everyone, I want us to be the hinge, not the cringe. We can do it. That is the thing of my dreams. Thank you.